Hello, my name is Nandagopan, and this presentation is based on my doctoral thesis titled Beyond Identity: Socio-Economic Implications of Caste as an Institution. In this thesis, I take a step back from the way economists have looked at caste, that is, as an identity, and see what it means to study caste as an institution and what the implications of that are for modern India. So let me begin with the basic starting point of the thesis. Why is it not enough to think of caste only as identity? Now, caste is often discussed through broad labels such as scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, OBCs, or general caste, etc. Now, yes, these categories are important. They matter for representation, policy, and justice, but they do not fully capture how caste works in everyday life. When caste is treated only as identity, we often focus on classification, that is, who belongs to which category. But that can miss the larger system in play. It can miss how caste is reproduced through marriage, through purity pollution practices, through household behavior, and through the way opportunities are passed across generations. So, my thesis asks us to look beyond identity and study caste as a system that is lived, enforced, and reproduced. Now, this thesis treats caste as a system rather than just a label. And by system, I mean something that organizes social relations and has real material consequences. It shapes who can marry whom, it shapes who is controlled within the households, it shapes how status is performed in public, and it shapes how opportunities and occupations are passed on. So, caste is not only symbolic, it's also social, economic, and institutional. And this is why the thesis brings together three things that are often studied separately, that is, gender, household expenditure, and mobility across generations. Now, the thesis is organized into three connected essays. The first essay studies women's autonomy and asks how caste norms affect women's freedom inside the household. The second essay studies households and asks whether the households that enforce caste norms spend money differently from those that do not. The third essay studies social groups across generations and asks whether caste still shapes occupational mobility in modern India. So, with each successive essay, we sort of broaden the analytical lens of the thesis. All three essays use data from the India Human Development Survey, which is a nationally representative survey. Now, the key point here is that these are not three separate stories. Together, they show how caste works across intimate, household, and long term social life. So, in essay one, I frame caste through two ideas: the idea of control and the idea of breach. On the one hand, caste is reproduced through control. That is, I find that households that practice untouchability are also more likely to show forms of tighter control over women's lives. This includes higher practice of veiling, a greater likelihood of men eating first in a household, and lower women's work participation. Now, these are not isolated household customs. Taken together, they suggest that caste hierarchy is sustained partly through the regulation of women's labor, movement, and everyday status within the household. On the other hand, I also look at breach. Here, I focus on the idea of intercaste marriage, which represents the crossing of caste endogamy, which is one of the central tenets through which caste reproduces itself. And the findings suggest that women in intercaste marriages report greater autonomy in decision making, physical mobility, economic autonomy, as well as social autonomy. So, the larger point of Essay 1 is not that caste constrains women, it is that women's lives are one of the key sites through which caste is both maintained and at times disrupted. Now, in second essay, we look at how caste operates through household spending, but it also approaches the question much differently than what the existing works do. Now, a lot of earlier discussion on social spending focuses on what we might call the idea of aspiration. The idea being that poorer or marginalized households may spend visibly in order to imitate higher status groups and signal upward mobility. Now, however, this essay looks at a different dynamic. It asks what happens when households that are already invested in maintaining status. In that case, spending is not mainly about moving up, it's about staying above, protecting rank, and preserving social distance. In simple terms, this is the difference between spending to emulate as opposed to spending to distinguish. Now, the essay suggests that caste conscious households may spend more on things that are publicly visible, socially coded, especially that like weddings, ceremonies, and other social functions where status is displayed and judged. That kind of spending can redirect resources away from long term investments such as education, health, nutrition, precautionary savings, and so on. So, the larger point here being that caste hierarchy is not only sustained through exclusion and belief, it is also sustained through status anxiety and the material performance of distinction. Now, in the third essay, we ask whether caste still shapes occupational mobility in modern India. In simple terms, I look at whether people move into different kinds of works than their parents, or whether occupations still tend to remain within families. Now, the findings suggest that continuity remains strong. That is, many sons still end up in the same or similar occupation as their father. However, there is a certain level of mobility, but that is limited and the gains are not shared equally across caste groups. What this suggests is that caste continues to shape how economic opportunities pass from one generation to the other, and therefore, even in a modernized, changing economy, caste remains part of the structure of opportunity. Now, the third essay also talks about why broad caste categories are useful but not enough. Labels like OBC are central to policy making, but they can often hide major differences within them. One category may contain subcastes with very different histories, different levels of advantage, and mobility outcomes. And that's what the graphic here tries to show. The right hand side introduces the idea of the Mandal Commission recommendations, which refer to the reforms that were implemented in the year 1990, which gave OBCs a 27% reservation in central government jobs. The idea here was to expand access to formal sector opportunities. My results here suggest that these reforms did help, but only modestly and not equally for everyone. Some subcastes that were better placed ended up benefiting more than the others. So the larger message here is simple that broad categories matter, but they can also hide internal inequalities. Now, when we're talking about the thesis contribution, first, the thesis argues that caste should not only be studied as an identity or as an administrative category, it should be understood as a system that organizes power, status, and opportunity. Second, it connects three domains that are often studied separately. That is women's autonomy, household expenditure, and occupational mobility across generations. Third, it shows why broad categories, while still important for policy, are often too blunt to capture how caste actually works in everyday life. Now, to understand that, we also need to look at the lived practices and differences within these groups. Now, taken together, the thesis offers a more integrated way of understanding caste as something that is reproduced through intimate life, economic behavior, and intergenerational opportunity. Now, let me conclude with the central message of this thesis. The thesis argues that caste in India should not only be understood as a social identity, but should be understood as a living system that shapes power, status, resources, and opportunity. Across the three essays, I show that this system is reproduced in everyday life through the control of women and marriage, through household spending that is tied to status and prestige, and through uneven transmission of occupational opportunity across generations. The broader implication here being that inequality persists not only because categories exist, but because social practices, material choices, and inherited structures continue to reproduce those very hierarchies. So the central contribution of this thesis is to move beyond caste as an identity and towards caste as a political economy and social institution. Now, before I close, I would like to thank my thesis supervisor, Professor Anirban Ghatak, as well as members of my research advisory committee, Professor Ashok Thomas and Professor Nivedita Bhanja, for their continued support and guidance. I would also like to thank the thesis evaluation committee, including Chair Professor Sthanu Nair, and the external examiners for their valuable feedback on my thesis. Thank you.